As Shirley Bassey once sang, it's all just a little bit of history repeating, which is the exact sentiment behind the Strauss-Howe Generational Theory. Presented in the book Generations, written by William Strauss and Neil Howe, the publication outlines a recurring generational cycle in American society. Now, according to this theory, when you were born and what state the world was in during the different parts of your life will determine a lot about you and your generation. But while this predictable pattern has been presented for Americans throughout time, what about wrestling fans? We've all seen the different eras in the WWE, and fans all become fans in different times and at different ages. But does this have an imprint on us in the same way as the Strauss-Howe generational study would suggest? Well, we're about to examine just that, because today, Dave knows the Strauss-Howe Generational Theory and Wrestling Eras. Okay, so to fully understand this, first we have to get our bearings on the Strauss-Howe Generational Theory itself. In short, just to give a quick, generalized, and very simplistic overview, the theory works something like this. There are 4 major stages of life: childhood, young adult, midlife, and elderhood. And there is also the same number of societal stages throughout time, which are called turnings. And finally, there are the same number of generational archetypes as well. Which archetype you belong to is greatly determined by which turning you were born under. Now, with all that out the way, let's give a quick rundown of what the turnings actually are. First, you have the high. This is when society and institutions are at their peak. As a whole, people are doing well and things are going in an agreed upon direction by society overall. And people tend to work together for the greater good. Next is the awakening. This is when society begins to question itself and wonders if the previously established institutions really are as good as they can be. Through this questioning, individuality becomes more of a focus over institutions as counterculture begins to emerge. Then this is followed by the unraveling. As a result of society's new contemplation, institutions are at their weakest and people have no faith in them. Society is now done re-examining everything from the old regime and has gone from merely questioning things to actively making changes to it. And finally, there is the turning known as the crisis. The desire for change has become a complete and total deconstruction of the old guard. Institutions may still exist, but society's value in them is, for the most part, very low. But during this, due to a lack of institutional power, community and new organizations will be needed once again. In order to reenact change to a larger scale, people begin to reform larger groups, which become the new regimes. But this time, these institutions are better, and they are the kind that people truly believe in and will help to repurpose a new and better society. Then, once this takes into effect, a brand new high turning begins and the entire cycle just starts all over again. Such as the WWF's 80s boom period, which was followed by the New Generation, then the Attitude Era, followed by the Ruthless Aggression Era, which then saw the PG Era. And yes, the turnover for these eras are much quicker than societal generations, but so is the attention span of your average wrestling fan. And it's in this that I think some interesting parallels can be made. Now I know, the first and most obvious connection is to compare both the Attitude Era and Hulkamania to high turnings. But if we do that, then the cycle is broken instantaneously because the Strauss-Howe Generational Theory doesn't really fit with 2 high periods being so close together. But I don't think comparing turnings to WWE's financial success is the best way to equate these 2 things. Let me put it this way. When I talked about the Strauss-Howe turnings, a lot had to do with institutions. Sure, monetary means were a factor, but it really has more to do with structures and societal change and how they relate to individuality. And that's exactly where I think we need to start looking. Because the WWE's eras have gone through very similar phases. And yes, money is a factor here too, but if we focus on institutions versus individuals, that's where we can see some real connections. For example, during the boom period of Hulkamania, there was a lot of emphasis on the individual, one individual in particular, Hulk Hogan. But even beyond him, promos weren't scripted. Honky Tonk Man just decided he wasn't going to give up the IC title, so he just didn't. Wrestlers could freely defect from one promotion to another with no fear of not being welcomed back with open arms if things didn't work out. Plus, this marked the end of the glory days for the NWA and the territory system. Institutions were at their weakest, and wrestling was actively making changes. While it might appear as a high economically, the 80s boom, in terms of structures, was actually an unraveling. Now, this led to the new generation, which was a crisis. The clique was running the show, with individuals calling the shots, and management was seemingly useless. WWF would eventually circle the drain towards bankruptcy. But during this time, the need for new institutions would become very apparent, as management would need to flex its muscle in order to course correct the entire company. But then, a high point would rise. The Attitude Era brought forth a new roster to represent the new direction of the company. Everyone was moving towards the same goal, defeating WCW with Crash TV. And with Vince becoming more active on television and Shane and Stephanie coming on board as well, management and institutions became more important than ever. However, with the fall of WCW and WWE becoming the sole survivor of the Monday Night Wars, wrestling began re-examining itself yet again. Technicians like Kurt Angle, Eddie Guerrero, and Chris Benoit began taking the main event. WWE began experimenting and wondering if things were as good as they possibly could be with a brand new awakening. Alright, so I think we can see the exact same patterns line up when we look at wrestling in this way. But what about how this relates to us fans? Well, as I mentioned earlier, the Strauss-Howe Generational Theory states that there are generational archetypes. But do these line up with our findings so far? Well, let's take a look. The first archetype is the prophet. Born during a high, they are introduced into a world where things are going great. As a result, they grow into senior citizens during a crisis. But because they first saw the world at its best, they naturally assume it will revert back to that no matter how bad things get. And their optimism helps to shepherd the young past the dark times. Next are the nomads. Born during a time when society is questioning itself, nomads turn into young adults attacking the system with a lot of passion, and head into old age as resilient elders having survived a crisis during their midlife. After them is the hero generation. Born into an unraveling period, they first see the world as team building comes back into fashion. They enter adult life during a crisis, but become leaders in their midlife during a new high and will receive a lot of credit for the triumph, only to become questioned during their final years during a brand new awakening. And finally, there are the artists. Being born into a crisis, they tend to be very overprotected as children. This results in them being more conformist during their young adulthood and very process-driven in their midlife. This all ends with them becoming very thoughtful in their twilight years. Okay, so how does this correlate to wrestling fans? Well, if you became a wrestling fan during the unraveling that was the 80s boom, such as myself, you would be a part of a hero generation for wrestling fans. We entered our wrestling midlife during the Attitude Era and often get praised for being the best demographic and the most desired audience for wrestling. On the other hand, if you first became a fan during the Attitude Era, then you fall into the prophet archetype, sticking it out with wrestling because you believe that it will get good again, remaining optimistic. And you're probably focusing on fundamentals and core concepts now during the PG era. If you became a fan during the new generation, you would be an artist. So that would make you somewhat of a conformist wrestling fan, adhering to the idea that strength of the company is what's best for wrestling. You may even be something of a screwjob apologist since you saw how wrestling improved as the needs of the individual were put aside in favor for the needs of the company. And finally, if you became a fan during the Ruthless Aggression era, you would be considered a nomad. First coming on board when wrestling was reevaluating its own system, you watched wrestling with less of a strict standard of what wrestling has to be, since you were introduced to it when wrestling dared to be anything in the WWE. But this constant need for change might have you surviving the PG era as an alienated fan. But what do you think about these assertions? Are they accurate? Is there a causation attached between the Strauss-Howe Generational Theory and different wrestling eras? Let me know down in the comments. And I want to give a big shout out to Double A for the brand new banners on both this channel and my comic book channel, Dave Knows Comics. Check out his channel to see how he does the magic that he does. Thank you again for the new banners. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe right here because as always, Dave knows.